It was a cool, breezy afternoon in downtown Los Angeles, the kind of day where the sun couldn't quite decide if it wanted to shine or hide behind the clouds. For Henry, the elderly man who had long been forgotten by the world, it was just another day of survival on the streets. The park he sat in was busy with people hustling and bustling around, but it was easy for Henry to blend into the background. Dressed in tattered clothes, his once sharp eyes now clouded with years of hardship, Henry had become a part of the park itself. No one really noticed him, not unless they were looking for someone to pity or spare a coin. But Henry wasn't the type to beg. He never had been. He preferred the quiet comfort of his corner under a large oak tree, where he could think and remember the life he had lost. That afternoon, as he sat on the edge of a cracked bench, something unusual caught his attention. A sleek, black car pulled up nearby, the kind that screamed wealth with its polished finish and dark windows. Henry barely paid it any mind. Cars came and went all the time, especially in this part of town. What grabbed his attention wasn't the car itself, but the man who stepped out of it. The man had an aura of confidence, one that made heads turn. He was tall, wearing a sharp suit, with his glasses perched just right on his face. His expression was one of calm authority, but there was something about him that struck Henry as different. Maybe it was the way he carried himself, like someone who knew what it was like to build something from the ground up, someone who had seen the depths and climbed out. As the man walked toward the park bench, his sleek shoes clicking against the pavement, his car made a sudden sputtering sound. The engine gave a loud cough and then stalled completely, its engine cut off with a dying sputter. "Damn it," the man muttered to himself, shaking his head in frustration. He tried to restart the car, but it refused to budge. Henry's eyes flicked toward the man. Normally, he would have kept to himself. After all, what could a homeless old man like him possibly do to help a man dressed like that? But today felt different. Maybe it was the quiet desperation he saw in the man's eyes, or maybe it was just the weather playing tricks on him. He stood up slowly, his knees creaking as he did. He wasn't much help anymore, not physically, but something told him that he could still offer advice. "Trouble with your car, sir?" Henry called out gently, stepping forward from the shadows of the tree. The man looked up, startled, as if he hadn't noticed Henry's presence until now. His sharp eyes narrowed as he assessed the old man. A slight frown formed on his face, but the frown quickly disappeared into a neutral expression. "I'm afraid so," the man replied, trying to start the engine again with no luck. "I think the battery's dead." Henry approached the car cautiously. He didn't want to seem too forward, but he had a knack for fixing things, especially when it came to engines. Years ago, before life took a turn, Henry had been a skilled engineer, a job he had loved. He'd worked on everything from cars to machinery, always the one people called when things broke down. "I might be able to help," Henry said, his voice low but steady. The man looked at him again, eyebrows raised. "Help? How?" His tone was skeptical, but there was something else in his eyes, perhaps curiosity or just a momentary lapse in judgment. Henry's hands trembled slightly, but he wasn't about to let that stop him. "If you've got a few minutes, I can take a look. I know a thing or two about engines." The man hesitated for a moment, glancing back at the car. Then, with a sigh, he opened the door and stepped back. "All right, but don't expect miracles," he muttered. Henry crouched down beside the car, his fingers moving over the hood with practiced ease. It had been years since he'd worked on anything like this, but the instinct was still there. The old man could still feel the hum of the mechanics in his hands, could still hear the way the engine wanted to run if only it were given a chance. "I'm Elon, by the way," the man said, watching as Henry worked. "Elon?" Henry repeated, looking up for a moment. "Nice name. You don't happen to be the Elon, do you?" "The one and only," Elon replied with a hint of amusement. Henry's eyes widened slightly. Elon Musk? The man who had revolutionized space travel, electric cars, and just about every tech field imaginable? He couldn't believe it. What was a billionaire doing here in this park with a broken car? Before Henry could process the thought further, he quickly returned to work, focusing on the task at hand. He took a deep breath, his hands steadying as he found the issue. After a few moments of fiddling under the hood, Henry's fingers worked their way to the battery and checked the connections. "It's just the terminals," Henry said after a few minutes. Corroded. That's why it wouldn't start. He grabbed a small tool from his pocket and cleaned the terminals, and within seconds, the engine sputtered to life, the sound of the motor purring to life in a way that felt familiar to Henry. There you go, Henry said, standing up and dusting his hands off. That should do it. Elon's eyes widened in surprise, and for a split second, Henry caught a glimpse of admiration on his face. That's incredible, Elon said. I didn't expect you to be able to fix it so easily. Henry gave a small smile, feeling a warmth spread in his chest. It was the first time in a long while someone had appreciated him for something other than his appearance or his age. Well, I've been around the block a few times, Henry said, shrugging nonchalantly. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. It was as if the world had paused around them, two people from entirely different walks of life sharing a simple, yet profound moment of connection. Thank you, Elon said finally, breaking the silence. You've saved me quite a headache. Henry smiled again. No problem. Just doing what I can. But little did he know, this small act of kindness would lead to something far greater than either of them could have imagined. By the way, Elon continued, I'm heading over to a cafe nearby. If you're interested, I could buy you a coffee. Seems like you could use a little warmth. Henry hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Sure, I could use a good cup of coffee. And with that simple offer, the two men, worlds apart, started on a journey that neither of them could have predicted. Henry had always thought of himself as a survivor, but at his age, the meaning of survival had changed. There were no longer dreams of accolades or future plans. Now, it was just about getting through the day. The city park had become his home, the trees and benches a form of shelter against the elements. In the mornings, he would walk the same few blocks, looking for a place to sit where the sun hit just right. His hands, once steady and strong, had now grown frail, and his back had a permanent stoop from years of neglect. But despite everything, Henry still had his mind. Years ago, he had been more than just a homeless man. He had been a respected architect, with a career that many people would envy. He designed buildings that changed skylines, had clients who depended on him, and a family who loved him. At least, that was how it had been before the world around him crumbled. Henry's mind often drifted back to those days. He remembered the way his wife, Linda, would smile when he came home after a long day of meetings. They had a quiet life, one that Henry cherished deeply. Their small home was filled with the hum of love and laughter, and he thought it would last forever. But fate, it seemed, had different plans. Linda had fallen ill unexpectedly. What started as a simple cold turned into something much worse. Henry could still hear the doctor's voice in his head. I'm sorry, Mr. West. It's advanced cancer. Those words had changed everything. Henry tried to remain strong. He spent every moment by her side, even as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months. But no matter how hard he worked to maintain their life, nothing could save her. Linda passed away in her sleep one peaceful morning, leaving Henry devastated and alone. That was the beginning of his downfall. After Linda's death, Henry withdrew from everything. He couldn't bear the idea of continuing without her. He stopped working. His job in architecture felt meaningless now. The sadness consumed him, and soon, the loneliness pushed him into a place he hadn't imagined. He found solace in alcohol, which numbed the pain and helped him forget, at least for a little while. But the more he drank, the less he cared about anything else. His career slipped away, and so did his relationships. His son, David, tried to reach out, but Henry was too far gone. Eventually, David gave up and moved away. Before he knew it, Henry had lost everything. The apartment was sold, the memories packed away, and the life he once had disappeared. He wandered the streets for years, surviving on whatever he could find, doing odd jobs when he could, but mostly, he sat in the park and watched life go on without him. Henry's only comfort these days came from the small interactions with people who, like him, were struggling. Sometimes, a kind word or a brief conversation with a passerby was enough to make the day feel a little less lonely. But mostly, he lived in silence, with only his thoughts and memories to keep him company. It wasn't always this way. There were days when he could still feel the spark of who he once was, the confident man who would take on any challenge, the engineer who could fix just about anything. He was sharp in his own way, and every once in a while, those moments would resurface, giving him the strength to push through. Henry could still remember the time when he had first learned about engineering. As a young man, fresh out of college, he had been fascinated by machines. He loved the idea of understanding how things worked, of fixing problems and creating solutions. His love for engineering had turned into a career in architecture, where he designed buildings that seemed to rise effortlessly from the ground. He had been proud of his work, knowing that he had contributed to the world in a meaningful way. But that had been a lifetime ago. These days, all Henry had was the park, his corner under the tree, and the occasional stranger who would talk to him. Life had become small, insular, and lonely, and Henry often wondered if things would ever change. As he sat on the edge of the park bench, staring down at his worn shoes, he thought about how easy it would be to just give up, to stop trying. No one cared about him anymore, and that was a hard truth to swallow. It felt like the world had moved on without him. But despite everything, there was still a small flicker of hope deep inside. Maybe things weren't over for him. Maybe he still had something to offer, even if he wasn't sure what that something was. The park around him was busy, full of people rushing by, lost in their own lives. Henry noticed a couple sitting on the grass nearby, their laughter light and carefree. A group of children ran past, their voices high-pitched with excitement as they played. The world seemed to go on, indifferent to the people like Henry who had been left behind. But just as he was about to turn his attention elsewhere, something caught his eye. A black car pulling into the lot near the entrance of the park. It was sleek and expensive, its tinted windows reflecting the gray sky above. Henry's heart skipped a beat. There was something about the car that drew him in. And then, to his surprise, a man stepped out of the car. The man was tall, wearing a sharp suit and glasses that caught the light. He moved with purpose, his steps confident and sure. For a moment, Henry thought he might be another businessman on the go, too busy to notice the people around him. But then, the man did something unexpected. He looked right at Henry. Their eyes met. Henry froze for a moment, unsure of what to do. The man didn't look away. Instead, he took a step toward him. For a brief second, Henry thought about looking away, about retreating back into the anonymity of his corner under the tree. But something made him stay. Maybe it was the fact that this man didn't immediately pass him by. Maybe it was the faint glimmer of recognition in the stranger's eyes. The man took another step closer, stopping just a few feet away from Henry. "Trouble with your car, sir?" Henry asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. The man glanced at him, his brow furrowing for a moment before he replied. "Yeah," the man said. "Seems like I've got a bit of a problem." Henry could tell the man was frustrated, but something in his eyes told him he wasn't the type to ask for help. Yet Henry, despite his own struggles, felt compelled to offer. "If you've got a few minutes, I could take a look," Henry said, his hands already moving as if he had never forgotten how to fix things. The man looked at Henry again, this time with a hint of disbelief. You know how to fix cars?" Henry shrugged. "I've been around." The man's gaze softened just a little. "All right, what do I have to lose?" As the man stepped aside to let Henry approach the car, Henry realized that this was more than just another fix-it job. This could be the beginning of something different, something unexpected. And little did he know, this small act of kindness would change the course of both their lives forever. As the engine hummed to life with a satisfying growl, Henry stepped back and wiped his hands on his pants, a small, satisfied grin tugging at his lips. It wasn't much. It wasn't like the grand designs he used to create, but it felt good to fix something, to feel useful again. For a moment, it was as if the years had melted away, and he was back to his old self, back when he had purpose and pride in his work. Elon stood beside him, his posture stiff as he observed the repair. "You really know what you're doing," he said, his voice laden with surprise. "I didn't expect that." Henry gave a modest shrug, feeling the weight of those words more than he let on. "I used to be good with my hands. Cars, buildings, whatever needed fixing, really." The words hung between them, and for a second, Henry wondered if he should say more. Should he explain how he had once built entire skylines, how he had touched the world in ways most people would never understand. But then, the reminder of what he had lost, the life, the family, pressed down on him, and he quickly decided against it. "Anyway, you're good to go now," Henry said, stepping away from the car. "Just make sure you get those terminals cleaned regularly. They can cause problems if you leave them unchecked." Elon nodded, looking at the car like it was a precious artifact that had been saved from the brink of destruction. "Thanks, man. I really appreciate it. Honestly, I was about to call a tow truck, but this saved me a ton of time." He reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out his wallet. "Let me at least give you something for your trouble." Henry raised a hand, shaking his head. "No need for that. I was just helping out." Elon hesitated for a moment, his brow furrowing. "I insist," he said, holding out a crisp bill. "It's the least I can do." Henry took a step back, his eyes narrowing slightly. He wasn't one to accept charity, not after everything he had been through. There was a sense of pride that still lingered in him, even in his most broken moments. "I'm not looking for handouts, sir," he said, his voice steady but firm. "Just a little kindness. That's all." Elon paused, seemingly taken aback by the elderly man's response. For a brief moment, the two men stood in silence, the only sound the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. Finally, Elon let out a small chuckle. "Well, I like your attitude. You're one of the few people I've met who doesn't want anything for a good deed." Henry didn't respond, his gaze drifting down to the cracked pavement beneath his feet. He wasn't used to the praise, not anymore. It had been so long since someone had noticed him for something other than his age or his situation. But there was something about Elon's presence that made Henry feel seen. A small flicker of pride sparked inside him, and for the first time in a while, he felt the faintest stirrings of hope. "Listen, man," Elon said, breaking the silence. "I'm about to head over to a cafe nearby. How about you join me? Get yourself something hot to drink. You look like you could use it." The offer hung in the air between them, and Henry hesitated. He wasn't sure if he should accept. A coffee with a billionaire? It seemed like an odd request, one that didn't fit with his life anymore. But then again, maybe this was a chance to talk to someone, to be more than just a man with no home and no future. He glanced at the park around them, at the people bustling by, oblivious to the quiet moment unfolding between two very different men. He could always go back to his corner under the tree, but today felt different. Maybe it was the way Elon had looked at him, or maybe it was the idea that, for once, someone had offered him more than just a passing glance. "All right," Henry said finally, the words slipping out before he could second-guess himself. "A coffee sounds good." Elon smiled, clearly pleased by Henry's response. "Great. Let's go." As they walked side by side toward the cafe, a strange silence settled between them. Henry couldn't help but steal glances at Elon, trying to process the surreal nature of the situation. This wasn't just some random businessman he had helped, it was Elon Musk, a man whose name was synonymous with innovation and success, a man who had changed the world in ways that Henry could barely comprehend. And here he was, walking with Henry like they were equals. The cafe was a trendy spot, with exposed brick walls and a modern, minimalist vibe. It was the kind of place that Henry would have never stepped foot in during his old life, back when he had money and status to spare. Now, it felt foreign and intimidating, like a world that had moved on without him. They took a seat at a small table by the window, the bustling energy of the cafe providing a stark contrast to the quiet of the park outside. Elon ordered a cappuccino for himself and a simple black coffee for Henry. "So," Elon said as he took a sip of his drink, "tell me about yourself, Henry. I'm curious." Henry raised an eyebrow. "What do you want to know?" Elon smiled slightly, setting his cup down. "Everything, if you're willing to share. You've got a story written all over you. I can tell you're not just some homeless guy off the street." The words stung a little, but Henry didn't let it show. He had long since stopped being offended by people's assumptions. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his hands folded in front of him as he carefully chose his words. "I used to be someone else," he began quietly, his voice rough with years of regret. "I was an architect, built buildings, designed cities, had a family, a life. Elon listened intently, his eyes never leaving Henry's face. "What happened?" he asked softly. Henry sighed, the weight of the question pressing down on him. "Life happened. My wife got sick. I couldn't save her. And after that, everything just fell apart. My career, my family, it all slipped through my fingers." Elon's expression softened, and he nodded as if he understood more than he let on. "It's tough. I get it. We all go through dark times." Henry looked up, meeting Elon's gaze. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel alone. There was something in Elon's eyes, a quiet understanding, that made Henry feel like maybe, just maybe, his life hadn't completely ended. "You know," Elon continued, leaning forward slightly, "sometimes we have to lose everything to realize what's really important. Maybe this is just the beginning of something new for you. Ever thought about starting over?" Henry chuckled bitterly, but there was a small flicker of hope in his chest. "Start over? I'm too old for that." Elon smiled. "You'd be surprised. Age doesn't mean you're out of the game. Maybe this is just your next chapter." As Henry sipped his coffee, the warmth of the drink spreading through him, he couldn't help but wonder if Elon was right. Could this be a turning point? Could one moment of kindness lead to something bigger? Maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something new. But as Henry mulled over the idea, a part of him couldn't shake the uncertainty, the lingering fear that the past, his past, would always follow him, no matter how much he tried to move forward. And in the back of his mind, he wondered if there was a price to the change that was coming. The cafe's warm, welcoming atmosphere felt like a stark contrast to the chilly streets Henry had wandered for so long. For a brief moment, as he sat across from Elon, Henry almost allowed himself to forget the weight of his past. It was as if time had stopped, and in this cozy space, everything was possible. As the conversation continued, Henry found himself speaking more than he had in years, letting down the walls he had so carefully built. He told Elon about the early days of his career, about the grand buildings he had designed, how he felt a sense of pride when each project was completed, knowing it would stand for years to come. He shared the story of his family, how his love for Linda had been unconditional, how they had spent countless evenings dreaming about their future together. Elon listened intently, nodding, but never interrupting. He seemed genuinely interested in Henry's life, his triumphs and his heartaches. "So you really did all that? You designed cities?" Elon asked, leaning forward with an almost childlike curiosity. Henry chuckled softly, a tinge of sadness in his voice. "Yes, I did. I was good at it. But that was another lifetime ago." The words lingered in the air, and for a moment, neither man spoke. Henry's gaze shifted to the window, where the city outside buzzed with life, oblivious to the conversation unfolding inside. It all seemed so far away, so out of reach. But Elon broke the silence. "I don't think it's too late for you, Henry." Henry met Elon's gaze, unsure if he was ready to believe those words. "What do you mean?" Elon smiled slightly, the corners of his mouth lifting as he spoke. "Sometimes, we get so caught up in what we've lost, we forget what we still have, the skills, the knowledge, the experience. I know you've been through a lot, but those things you did, they don't disappear. They're part of who you are. You can still use them." Henry shook his head, his hands gripping the cup tightly, as though he were trying to hold onto the fleeting hope Elon was offering. "I'm too old, too far gone." Elon's eyes sparkled with conviction. "Don't sell yourself short. Age doesn't define your worth. What you've done, what you can do, those things don't have an expiration date. You're not done yet, Henry. Trust me." Henry took a deep breath, the weight of Elon's words sinking in slowly. There was a fire in the billionaire's voice, an energy that Henry hadn't felt in years. It was a strange sensation, as though a door had been opened in his mind that he hadn't even known existed. But Henry wasn't ready to step through it. "Not yet. Why are you helping me?" Henry asked quietly, his voice thick with skepticism. "You don't know me. I'm just an old man with nothing left to offer." Elon didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "I help people because I believe in the potential we all have. I've seen it time and time again. People get knocked down, and they think it's the end. But it's not. You're still here. You're still breathing. And that means you've got something left to give. Henry was silent, the weight of Elon's words pressing down on him. It felt like a challenge to face his past, to confront the person he once was, and see if there was anything left of him in the present. As the conversation wound down, Elon offered to drive Henry back to his spot in the park, a kind gesture that Henry couldn't refuse. As they walked out of the cafe and into the crisp air, Henry felt the familiar tinge of doubt creeping in again. What if this was all just some dream, some fleeting moment of kindness that would soon fade? What if he didn't have the strength to change? But then, as they approached the car, something shifted within him. Elon's words, the encouragement, the belief in him. Something inside Henry stirred, something he hadn't felt in years, a spark of possibility. They reached the car, and Elon turned to Henry. "Listen," he said, "I've got a meeting tomorrow with a group of investors. We're talking about building a new project, a city that combines sustainability with innovation. I'd like you to be a part of it." Henry blinked in surprise. "Wait, what?" Elon smiled. "I know it might seem crazy, but I think you're the person who can bring something special to the table. You're an architect, Henry, and I think you still have the vision in you. So, if you're open to it, I want to give you the chance to prove it." Henry's mind raced as the weight of Elon's offer settled in. A part of him wanted to refuse, to retreat back into his old life of quiet despair. But another part of him, one that had been buried deep within for so long, felt the pull of something greater. I don't know what to say," Henry muttered, his heart pounding in his chest. Elon grinned. "You don't have to say anything right now. Just think about it. I'll give you a day or two, but I think you'll find that you're capable of a lot more than you realize." Henry stood there for a moment, frozen, trying to process what was happening. A part of him wanted to walk away, to let this opportunity slip through his fingers. But another part of him, a part he hadn't heard in a long time, was screaming for him to take it. This was more than just a chance to get back on his feet. This was an opportunity to change his life, to reclaim his purpose. And yet, doubts clouded his thoughts. Could he really do this? Was he truly capable of stepping back into a world that had left him behind? Elon, sensing his hesitation, placed a hand on his shoulder. "Henry, I know it's scary, but don't let fear keep you from something better. Sometimes, the hardest step is just believing you can take it." Henry nodded slowly, his mind still reeling from the magnitude of what Elon was offering. He wasn't sure where this path would lead, but for the first time in years, he felt the weight of possibility, of a new beginning, pressing against him. As he climbed into the car, the engine roared to life once more, and Henry stared out of the window, his heart pounding in his chest. What was he going to do next? Could he really take the leap? The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Henry's journey was far from over. The next 2 days passed in a blur for Henry. He couldn't stop thinking about the offer Elon had made. At night, when the world was quiet and all he had were his thoughts, he would lie awake in his makeshift bed on the park bench, staring at the stars, trying to make sense of it all. He had been living in the shadows of his past for so long that the idea of stepping back into the light seemed both impossible and irresistible. The more he thought about it, the more the fear of failure gripped him. Could he really pull this off? Could he be the man he once was, capable of designing grand structures, of building something that mattered? His hands, once steady and sure, now trembled when he reached for anything. His mind, once sharp and clear, often fogged with uncertainty. But then, there were moments when the fear subsided, when he remembered the pride he had felt, the joy of creation, and the people whose lives he had touched through his work. He remembered the thrill of a project coming to life, brick by brick, and the satisfaction of seeing something he had designed standing tall in the skyline. That feeling, that spark, flickered within him again. It wasn't gone. It was still there. And Elon's offer, no matter how unbelievable, was an opportunity to reignite it. It was early in the morning when he made his decision. The sky was just beginning to lighten, the air crisp and cool. He had been pacing by the park's entrance for hours, his mind racing, when a familiar black car pulled up beside him. Elon stepped out, his usual calm, collected self, a faint smile playing at his lips as he saw Henry. "I didn't think you'd come," Elon said with a slight laugh, as though he were almost teasing Henry for the uncertainty he'd shown. "I was starting to think I'd have to drag you here myself." Henry looked up at him, the weight of his decision heavy on his shoulders. "I've thought about it a lot," he said, his voice hoarse from lack of sleep. "I'm not sure I'm the man you think I am, Elon. I've been away from this world for too long." Elon's eyes softened, and he placed a reassuring hand on Henry's shoulder. "You've got more in you than you realize. I've seen it, and I wouldn't offer this to anyone if I didn't believe it." Henry felt the knot in his stomach tighten. The fear was still there, but so was the urge to take that first step, to prove to himself that he wasn't done. "I'm ready," he said, his voice steady despite the pounding in his chest. "I want to try." Elon's smile widened, and for the first time, Henry saw the warmth in his eyes, a sincerity that went beyond just helping someone in need. Elon believed in him. The drive to the meeting was quiet, the hum of the car the only sound between them. Henry gazed out the window, watching the city pass by, the same city that he had once shaped with his hands. His mind was a whirlwind, torn between excitement and fear, between hope and doubt. But as they approached the building where the meeting was to take place, a feeling settled within him. It wasn't just nerves, it was a strange sense of calm. He was doing this. He was stepping back into a world he thought had abandoned him. When they arrived, Elon led Henry into a sleek, modern conference room where a group of investors were already seated, chatting amongst themselves. They paused when Elon entered, their eyes briefly flicking to Henry, then back to Elon. "Gentlemen," Elon said, his voice authoritative, yet casual, "this is Henry Walker, an architect who's going to help us reshape the future." Henry froze for a moment. The words hung in the air, and for a brief second, he felt the weight of the room's scrutiny fall on him. The investors looked him up and down, clearly unsure about the man who had just appeared out of nowhere, a homeless, elderly man with no clear connection to their high-tech world. But then Elon spoke again, his tone unwavering. "Henry has an incredible vision. He's going to lead the design of the new project, what we're calling the Sustainable Future Initiative. I believe in him, and I think you should too." Henry's heart raced. It was happening. He was being handed the reins to something monumental. But as he looked around the room at the well-dressed, successful men and women staring back at him, doubt crept in. Could he really do this? Elon must have sensed Henry's hesitation because he stepped closer, lowering his voice so only Henry could hear. "Just remember, Henry, this is your chance. Don't let the past define you. You're not the same man you were before. You're someone different now." Henry nodded, his throat tight. With a deep breath, he turned toward the investors and cleared his throat. "Well," he began, his voice shakier than he had intended, "I may not be what you expected, but I've built cities before. I've seen the future, and I know how to make it happen." It wasn't the most eloquent speech, but it was real. It was him, and that was all he had to offer. The room was silent for a beat, the tension almost unbearable. Then, one of the investors, a tall, middle-aged man, leaned forward, his expression skeptical. "What makes you think you're capable of leading something like this?" he asked, his tone challenging. Henry's eyes met his with a steady gaze. "Because I've been to the bottom," he said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I've seen what it's like to lose everything, but I've also learned that you can't give up. You fight. You rebuild. And that's what we're going to do here. We're going to build something that lasts. Something that matters." There was a long pause, and then the skeptical investor nodded. "All right, Henry," he said, his tone begrudgingly respectful. "Let's see what you've got." And just like that, it began. The doors had opened, and Henry had stepped through them. He was no longer the broken man who had wandered the streets. He was a man with a purpose, with a chance to build something great again. As the meeting continued, Henry found his confidence growing. The ideas flowed, the plans began to take shape, and with each passing minute, the vision of the future he had once dreamed of began to come to life. The world was watching, but for the first time in years, Henry didn't care. He wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone anymore. This was his second chance, and he was going to take it, no matter what. The next few weeks flew by in a blur. Henry found himself swept up in the whirlwind of meetings, blueprints, and late-night discussions. The Sustainable Future Initiative was unlike anything he had ever been a part of. It wasn't just about designing buildings. It was about reshaping entire communities, about creating spaces that would benefit future generations. It was a vision so bold, so grand, that it seemed impossible. And yet, Henry was right in the thick of it, designing some of the most innovative and sustainable structures the world had ever seen. But as the days passed, a part of Henry kept waiting for the other shoe to drop. He had spent so many years believing that he wasn't good enough, that the world had moved on without him. Now that he was living the life he had once dreamed of, it felt almost unreal. He often found himself looking in the mirror, not recognizing the person staring back at him. Who was this man who had once been homeless and forgotten, now sitting at the helm of a groundbreaking project? One evening, as he sat in his office, poring over the final drafts of the designs, his phone buzzed. It was a text from Elon. "How are you holding up, Henry? Need a break? Let's grab dinner tomorrow." Henry stared at the screen for a moment, feeling a wave of gratitude. Elon had been more than just a benefactor. He had been a mentor, a friend. It wasn't just the opportunity Elon had given him. It was the belief he had shown, the trust he had placed in him when no one else would have. The next evening, they met at a small restaurant in the city, a far cry from the luxurious venues Elon often frequented. They ordered simple dishes, and for a while, it felt like they were just two old friends catching up. "You're doing amazing work, Henry," Elon said between bites of his meal. "I don't think I've seen anyone this invested in a project in a long time. You've really thrown yourself into it." Henry smiled faintly, his fingers tapping on the edge of his glass. "I'm trying. I'm not the man I used to be, but I'm getting there. This is my second chance." Elon raised an eyebrow. "Your second chance? I think it's your first chance, honestly. Your past doesn't define you, Henry. It's just a part of the journey. You're shaping the future now." Henry chuckled softly, but inside, the weight of Elon's words settled deeply within him. It was hard to let go of the past, the failures, the mistakes, the things he couldn't change. But Elon was right. The future was what mattered now. What he did next, what he built, would be his legacy. "I've been thinking a lot about that," Henry admitted. "About my past. I spent so many years blaming myself for the things that went wrong. I thought I had nothing left to offer. But now, with this project, it feels like I'm doing something real again. Something that matters." Elon nodded thoughtfully, then leaned back in his chair. "You know, when I started SpaceX, there were countless people who told me it would never work, that I was too ambitious, that I was wasting my time. But I kept pushing, because I knew that if I didn't, I'd regret it for the rest of my life. I think you're doing the same thing now, Henry. You're pushing past your doubts and fears, and that's what makes you different. That's what will make this project a success." Henry felt a deep sense of appreciation for Elon's unwavering belief in him. It was a belief that he had never truly had in himself until recently. "I don't think I could have done this without you," Henry said quietly, looking up at Elon. "You gave me the chance when no one else would." Elon gave him a small smile. "All I did was remind you of what you already had inside of you. You've done the rest." The conversation shifted as they talked about the specifics of the project, materials, sustainable technologies, and the designs that were slowly taking shape. But as the evening wore on, Henry's mind kept returning to the same thought. He was not the man he used to be. He had finally found his place in the world again, and it wasn't defined by his past failures or the years he had spent homeless. It was defined by the work he was doing now, the future he was helping to build. As the night came to a close, Henry felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of peace. He had been through so much, lost so much, but now he was beginning to understand something important. His story was not over. It wasn't just about the triumphs of the past or the failures along the way. It was about the choices he made now, the path he chose to walk moving forward. The next morning, Henry stood in front of the construction site where the first phase of the Sustainable Future Initiative was beginning. The foundation was being laid. The first steel beams were being erected, and Henry could hardly believe it was real. He walked through the site, the sounds of workers and machinery filling the air, and for the first time in years, he felt alive. He wasn't just overseeing the work, he was part of it. This was his vision coming to life, his ideas taking shape. And as he looked around, he realized something. He had a place in this world. The project was more than just a job. It was a symbol of everything he had overcome. The hardships, the loneliness, the doubts. It was a testament to the fact that no matter how far you fall, no matter how low you sink, you can always rise again. And in that moment, Henry knew he had found his true purpose, not in the grand designs or the towering buildings, but in the people he was helping, in the change he was creating. His journey had been long, but it had led him to this point, where he could make a real difference. Later that afternoon, Elon called him. "Henry," Elon said, his voice full of excitement, "I just saw the latest progress report. This is big. People are going to be blown away by what we're doing here. You're changing the world." Henry smiled, looking out at the construction site one last time. The sun was setting behind the half-built structures, casting a golden light across the landscape. "Yeah," Henry replied quietly, "I think we are." As the phone call ended, Henry stood there for a moment longer, soaking in the feeling of accomplishment. He had done it, not alone, but with the help of people who believed in him, who saw his potential even when he couldn't see it in himself. The road ahead was still uncertain, but Henry now understood one thing for certain. Life wasn't about how far you fell, it was about how you chose to rise again. As the days turned into weeks and then into months, Henry's life began to transform in ways he never could have imagined. The project, which had once felt like a distant dream, was now his reality. The construction site that had been a barren patch of land just months ago was now a bustling hub of activity, with cranes, trucks, and workers moving in every direction. Each day brought new challenges, but also new triumphs, and Henry was in his element, leading the charge toward a future that felt brighter than any he had ever known. But the changes in Henry's life weren't just confined to the project. As word of his involvement in the groundbreaking initiative spread, people began to take notice. His story of redemption, of rising from the depths of homelessness to being part of one of the most ambitious projects in the world, inspired countless others. It wasn't just the media that was interested. People from all walks of life reached out to him. Some wanted to interview him, others just wanted to thank him for showing them that it was never too late to turn things around. Henry had become a symbol of hope, a living testament to the power of perseverance and second chances. One afternoon, as he sat in a small cafe near the construction site, catching up on emails and plans for the next phase of the project, a young man approached him. He was in his early 20s, wearing a worn-out jacket and carrying a notebook. "Excuse me, Mr. Walker?" the young man asked hesitantly. Henry looked up, a little surprised. He had grown used to people coming up to him with words of encouragement, but there was something about this man's earnestness that caught his attention. "Yeah," Henry replied, setting his coffee aside and giving the young man his full attention. I just wanted to say thank you," the young man said, his voice shaking slightly. "Your story, what you've been through, it's made me believe that maybe I can get out of the hole I'm in, too. I've been stuck for so long. I've been homeless, and I don't know where to go. But when I heard about you, it made me think, maybe I can change." Henry's heart clenched at the words. He could see so much of his younger self in the man standing before him. The same pain, the same feeling of hopelessness. "You're welcome," Henry said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I was in your shoes once. I know it feels like there's no way out. But trust me, there is. You've got to keep fighting, even when it feels impossible." The young man nodded, tears welling up in his eyes. "I'm trying, but it's hard. I don't have anyone to turn to. I don't know where to start." Henry leaned forward, his gaze soft but steady. "Start by believing in yourself," he said, his voice firm with the kind of conviction that only comes from living through hardship and rising above it. "It's not going to be easy, but you can do it. You've got to take one step at a time, no matter how small. And when you fall, and you will fall, you get back up. You don't give up. That's the first lesson I learned." The young man looked at him, a glimmer of hope sparking in his eyes. "Thank you," he whispered. "I won't forget this." As the young man left, Henry sat back in his chair, a strange warmth filling his chest. He had no idea if that conversation would be the turning point for the young man, but he hoped it was. He had once been that lost soul, wandering through the streets, unsure of where he belonged. Now, he was reaching out to others, offering them the same hope he had found. Henry couldn't help but wonder how many others were out there. People who felt like they had nothing, who believed their lives were over. How many could he help, if only they knew his story? If only they knew that they weren't alone. Later that evening, as he walked through the nearly finished section of the project site, Henry reflected on how far he had come. Not just in terms of his career or the project, but as a person. He had found his purpose, yes, but more than that, he had found a way to give back, to use his second chance to inspire others to find their own. The project had started as something that was just about buildings and design, but it had become so much more. It was about community, about building a future where people could thrive, where no one had to feel invisible, where no one had to lose hope. And Henry was at the heart of it all, guiding the vision and the values that would make the Sustainable Future Initiative not just a success, but a legacy. It wasn't just the investors or the developers who were watching. It was the people, the families, the workers, the dreamers, who were seeing what was possible when people like Henry got a second chance. And that, to Henry, was worth more than any building, any design, any accolade. As the first building of the project was completed and the ribbon was cut, Henry stood at the front, his heart swelling with pride. There was no grand speech, no showy presentation. Instead, he looked out at the crowd gathered before him and simply said, "This is for all of you. For everyone who believed in this, and for everyone who thought they couldn't make it. You can. We all can." The crowd erupted into applause, and Henry felt a rush of emotion he had never expected. He wasn't just leading a project anymore. He was leading a movement of people who, just like him, had been given a chance to start over. The ripple effect had begun, and it was spreading, touching lives, changing futures. And in that moment, Henry realized that this was the real achievement, the lives he had touched, the people who had found hope in his story. He was no longer just the homeless elderly man who had helped Elon Musk. He was a man who had helped change the world, and that was a title he could be proud of. The morning sun poured through the expansive windows of the newly completed building, casting long shadows on the polished floors. Henry stood in the center of the lobby, his hands tucked in his pockets, taking in the quiet beauty of the space. It was a striking structure, sleek, modern, and a testament to everything he had learned and worked for. But it wasn't just the design that made it special. It was the purpose behind it. This building wasn't just a structure of steel and glass. It was a symbol of resilience, hope, and the possibility of redemption. As Henry walked through the building, he reflected on everything that had led to this moment. The late nights, the tireless meetings with architects and developers, the constant doubts about whether he was truly capable of pulling it all off. But now, as the sunlight streamed into the atrium, filling the space with warmth and life, it felt like everything had come together perfectly. Soon, the world would take notice. This wasn't just a small local project anymore. It had grown into something bigger, something that was starting to make waves across industries. The media had picked up on the success of the initiative, and soon, news outlets, social media, and even government officials were starting to pay attention. The message of sustainability and innovation that Henry had helped bring to life was no longer a niche idea. It was the future. As he stepped outside, the sound of cameras and reporters filled the air. Henry wasn't used to being in the spotlight. He had spent so many years hiding in the shadows, invisible to the world, that it felt surreal to be standing at the center of it all now. Yet, as he approached the podium for the press conference, he felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. This was no longer just about him. This was about something far greater, a movement that would change the way people thought about the world. The press conference was a blur of flashing cameras and rapid-fire questions. Elon was there, of course, standing beside him as they addressed the crowd. Henry had always admired Elon's confidence, his ability to speak with conviction and vision. But today, Henry stood beside him with the same sense of purpose. He had a story now, too, and he wasn't afraid to share it. "Mr. Walker," one reporter asked, holding up a microphone, "you've been through so much in your life, from homelessness to now leading one of the most ambitious and sustainable projects in the world. How do you reconcile those two extremes? How do you explain your journey?" Henry took a deep breath. This was the question he had been waiting for, the question that had haunted him for so long. He looked out at the sea of reporters, feeling their eyes on him. For a moment, the weight of it all threatened to overwhelm him. But then he thought about the young man in the cafe, the one who had asked for his help. He thought about the people he had met along the way, people who had believed in him when he couldn't believe in himself. And he realized that this wasn't just about him anymore. "It's been a long road," he began, his voice steady but strong. "A road filled with mistakes, failures, and times when I thought I would never make it out. But what I've learned is that it's never too late. No matter where you start or how far you fall, you can always rise. You just have to keep moving forward, even when it feels impossible." There was a pause before the next reporter spoke, clearly moved by his words. "Are you planning on using your platform to inspire others, to help more people in similar situations?" the reporter asked. Henry smiled, a quiet pride in his heart. "Absolutely. This project is just the beginning. It's not just about building structures. It's about building communities, helping people rediscover their potential. I've been given a second chance, and I want to make sure others get that chance too. Everyone deserves to believe that they can rise above their circumstances." As the press conference continued, Henry felt a shift within himself. He had once been afraid of being judged, of people seeing him as a failure. But now, he was standing tall, sharing his story with the world, and embracing his place in the narrative. He wasn't just an elderly man who had helped Elon Musk. He was a symbol of the resilience of the human spirit, a living example that it was never too late to change, to grow, and to make an impact. The conference ended, and as the reporters dispersed, Elon pulled Henry aside, a proud grin on his face. "You did great, Henry," Elon said, clapping him on the back. "I knew you had it in you." Henry nodded, still processing everything. "Thanks, Elon. But it's not just about me. It's about the people we're helping. We're changing lives. We're showing people that no matter how lost they feel, there's always hope." Elon's smile softened. "You're right. And that's why this project is so special. It's not just about buildings. It's about building a better future for everyone." As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the city, Henry walked away from the podium, feeling a deep sense of accomplishment. The world had taken notice. His story was being heard, and it was inspiring others to believe in themselves, just as he had. And for the first time in his life, Henry felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The months that followed were nothing short of transformative. The project that Henry had helped lead, the Sustainable Future Initiative, had not only completed ahead of schedule but had exceeded every expectation. The buildings stood as symbols of innovation, sustainability, and the power of human determination. Each structure was more than just a place to work or live. They were testaments to the potential of a brighter tomorrow, a future that valued both progress and compassion. But for Henry, it wasn't the towering structures that mattered most. It was the faces he saw every day. Those of the workers, the families moving into the new sustainable homes, the young students inspired by the possibilities that lay ahead. Every handshake, every conversation, every thank you from someone who had been impacted by the project, it all added up to something greater than he had ever imagined. One chilly evening, as Henry stood at the edge of the site, watching the lights of the city twinkle in the distance, a familiar figure approached him. It was Elon, who had been a constant presence throughout the entire process. Though their collaboration had started as a partnership rooted in business, it had grown into a deep, lasting friendship. "You've built something incredible here, Henry," Elon said, standing beside him and taking in the view. "This is more than just a project. It's a movement." Henry smiled, looking down at the blueprint in his hands, the one he had started sketching all those years ago, when he was still living on the streets. The same blueprint that had once seemed so out of reach now lay in the form of a thriving community. "It's been a team effort," Henry replied, his voice filled with gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without everyone who believed in this. And honestly, I wouldn't have gotten here without your support, Elon. You took a chance on me when I needed it most. Elon shook his head. You earned that chance, Henry. I saw something in you from the very beginning. It wasn't just about your ideas. It was about who you are. Your strength, your heart. That's what made the difference. The two men stood in silence for a few moments, the weight of their journey hanging in the cool night air. Henry thought about everything he had overcome. The years of hardship, the time spent wondering if he'd ever be more than a forgotten man on the streets. But now, here he was, standing at the helm of a project that would change the lives of thousands. He had built more than buildings. He had helped build hope. I never imagined my life would turn out this way, Henry said quietly, his eyes scanning the horizon. I thought I was lost, like there was no way out. But I guess, if you keep fighting, if you just keep going, you can find your way. Elon placed a hand on his shoulder. You've proven that to the world, Henry. You've shown everyone that it's never too late to make a difference, no matter where you start. As the night deepened, the city below continued to hum with life. Henry had always felt like an outsider, someone who didn't belong, someone who had missed his chance. But now, he saw his life in a new light. He had found his place, not only in the world, but in the hearts of others. A few weeks later, the grand opening of the Sustainable Future Initiative drew people from across the country. Politicians, business leaders, and families gathered to witness the unveiling of what had quickly become one of the most talked-about projects in the world. But Henry wasn't there to collect accolades. He was there to share a moment with those who had supported him, to celebrate the lives that had been touched. Standing in front of the crowd, Henry took a deep breath, ready to speak. The applause faded as the room fell silent, all eyes on him. He had never been one for speeches. He had spent so many years speaking to no one, living in the shadows. But today, he knew that his words mattered. Thank you, Henry began, his voice steady and clear. Thank you for believing in me, for believing in this project. But most of all, thank you for believing in the idea that anyone, no matter their past, can create a new future. This project is a reflection of that belief. He paused, looking out at the crowd, letting his words sink in. There was a time when I thought I had nothing left to give, but I learned that no matter how far you've fallen, no matter what you've lost, you can always rise again. The key is not to give up. The key is to never stop moving forward, even when it feels impossible. The crowd was silent, hanging on every word. Henry continued. This project isn't just about buildings. It's about people. It's about creating spaces where we can all thrive, where we can all have a chance to rebuild, to grow, and to live with dignity. I want everyone who walks through these doors to feel like they belong. I want them to know that they have the power to change their lives, just as I had the chance to change mine. The applause that followed was deafening. But for Henry, it wasn't the applause that mattered. It was the truth behind his words. He had found his purpose, not just in the work he had done, but in the lives he had touched, the people he had inspired. As the evening wore on, Henry stood off to the side, watching the crowd celebrate. He wasn't the center of attention. He didn't need to be. His work, his impact, spoke for itself. And then, as the festivities began to wind down, a young woman approached him, one of the many people he had inspired. She was holding a small envelope. "Mr. Walker," she said with a shy smile, handing him the envelope, "I just wanted to say thank you. Your story changed my life. You made me believe in myself." Henry's heart swelled as he took the envelope from her. "You're welcome," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But it's not just me. It's you. You have the power to change your life. Never forget that." As the night came to a close, Henry took one last look at the building, the symbol of all that he had achieved and all that was yet to come. His journey had been long and filled with challenges, but it had led him to this moment. He had created something that would last long after he was gone. He had left a legacy, not just in concrete and steel, but in the hearts of the people whose lives had been changed. And in that moment, Henry knew that he had truly found his place in the world. He had risen, and now he would always be remembered.